You're listening to episode 267 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Nathan Jishin Michon and Daniel Clarkson Fisher speak with us about 1,000 Hands, a guidebook to caring for your Buddhist community. Hi everyone. Before we begin today's episode, I would like to mention that this podcast and the supporting website, discussion forums, our live online practice circle, and other services provided by the Secular Buddhist Association are supported by you. If you find this episode or any other offerings helpful to you in some way, I ask that you take a moment and visit secularbuddhism.org and click on the contributions button. There are many ways you can help which are listed on that page, and if you make a donation, it's tax deductible and helps ensure the SBA is able to continue the exploration of secular Buddhism. Thank you. We're glad to have you join us in on the conversation. Many of us who attend a Buddhist or meditation center simply stop by a few times a week, or perhaps just once for a community sit. Some may also volunteer their time and talents in some way, setting out tea, ringing bells, keeping the space in good order, or perhaps even delivering talks or other programming. Very few, though, find themselves in the often chaotic role of managing a Buddhist community. If you've been trained as a teacher or received transmission, you may be very comfortable with guiding meditations, giving talks, or providing direction to those who are beginning their contemplative journey. But there's more, so very much more to supporting a community that we may need a little help with. Nathan Jishin Michon is a PhD student at the Graduate Theological Union studying Buddhist caregiving. He is ordained as both an interfaith minister and as a Buddhist minister, and primarily practices in both the Thai forest and Shingon traditions. He previously worked for 3 years as an editor for Fo Guangshan, earned his MDiv at University of the West, and MA in Comparative Religion at Western Michigan University. Nathan also trained in Peace and Conflict Studies at the European Peace University in Austria, and interned at related organizations, such as Peace Action Training and Research Institute of Romania and Peace Revolution in Thailand. Daniel Clarkson Fisher is a documentary filmmaker and writer whose work has appeared in outlets that include Alternet, Religion Dispatches, Tricycle, The Buddhist Review, Patheos, Lion's Roar, Inquiring Mind, Turning Wheel Media, and Buddha Dharma, The Practitioner's Quarterly. He established and served as the first chair of the Master of Divinity in Buddhist Chaplaincy program at the University of the West. In addition, he has served as adjunct faculty for Antioch Education Abroad's Buddhist Studies program in Bodh Gaya, India, and adjunct faculty in chaplaincy at Hartford Seminary. A dedicated environmental educator, he was trained and certified as a climate reality leader by former U.S. Vice President Al Gore and the Climate Reality Project in 2012. and completed the Aldo Leopold Foundation's Land Ethic Leader program in 2014. He now lives in Toronto, Canada. Special thanks to our friend Karma Yonten Gyatso of the Sumeru Press for his arranging today's interview. So sit back, relax, and have a nice jasmine pearl tea. Our guests today are Daniel Fisher. Danny, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Ted. Nice to see you.
And Nathan Michon. Nathan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
So you are both co-editors of a new book that's come out from our friends at Sumeru Press. And what I'd like to do to get us started is just have each of you say a little bit about your background. Nathan, let's start with you.
Well, I've been interested in Buddhism for close to 2 decades now, and through college originally, and then I've lived in a number of countries and kind of world hopped, going from temples in Taiwan, Korea, Japan, Thailand, and going to grad schools in between, but was slowly got a big interest in chaplaincy and caregiving and looking to how these 2 cares of mine came together. So.
Thank you. And Danny, how about you?
Well, I've been interested in, I guess, what people would call Buddhist pastoral studies or sort of Buddhist theology, and engaged Buddhism for a long time. As an undergraduate, I traveled to India on Antioch Education Abroad's Buddhist Studies program, went to Naropa University for their MDiv program, the University of the West for their Doctorate of Buddhist Studies program. And since then, I've worked a couple places. I worked for Antioch as a TA on their Buddhist Studies program about 10 years ago, been adjunct faculty at Hartford Seminary, and then I co-founded with the late Ken Locke the Master of Divinity in Buddhist Chaplaincy program at University of the West, and was the first chair of the department and all of that for a number of years. And then I fell in love with my wife, who's the contributor to the book. She wrote 2 chapters, and we moved to Toronto. So I'm here and kind of doing some new work now in documentary filmmaking, but I'm also on the advisory committee for the burgeoning Buddhist studies programs and Buddhist caregiving programs at Emmanuel College of University of Toronto, here in Toronto.
Terrific. Thank you. So continuing on with you, Danny, I'm wondering if you might tell the story of how you 2 first met.
Well, I met Nathan actually a long time ago when I was still a student at UWest. Nathan came to visit. He was a prospective student, and a group of us all sort of had lunch. And Nathan, with his graduate background in Michigan and his extensive travel at that point, which wasn't as extensive as it is now, but he'd been starting his world hopping at that point. He just struck me as an interesting guy. And then he came into the MDiv program at UWest when I was working on it. Nathan's just a great person and a great student to work with. So, always enjoyed working with him. And one day he came to see me, and he had been working for Buddha's Light Publishing in Los Angeles. And at that point, they were interested in possibly doing a book that had something to do with chaplaincy. And Nathan, having been a student of mine, knew that we had been doing basically a lot of extrapolating from non-Buddhist sources, guidebooks to chaplaincy and other kinds of caregiving that weren't necessarily written for a Buddhist audience. So, as Buddhist students, you do the best you can with them to say, well, how would we phrase that as Buddhists, or how would we do that differently as Buddhists? And so Nathan said, there are these books, that we use in the program. And, we're always saying there should be a book like this for Buddhists. So why don't we try it? And it sounded fairly daunting, I have to admit, at the beginning, because we were thinking of a book that pretty much looks like this one, with dozens of contributors and dozens of subject headings. And we kind of had a sense that it would be good to to reach out. We had quite a network. I mean, even within U.S., we had students like Mark Ragsdale, who had a background in special education, and Noel Alamit, who had a background in AIDS work, and Ray McDonald, who worked with veterans. It sort of felt like we had all these great people in our networks that we knew who could contribute, but corralling everybody and putting it together, it seemed scary, but Nathan was great at holding my hand through
herding Buddhist cats.
Yeah.
Nathan, how about you? What's your perspective, this gem of starting this book? What was that like for you?
Well, I think going back even a little further, I remember one conversation with a nun at a temple once, and there were a group of us just as the chaplaincy program at University of the West was getting started, and I was just about to move into the program, and this nun was asking more about, what do you actually study in this? And once we started telling her and about all the different classes and books and subjects, she just said, oh gosh, we could really use that sort of training for us at the temple. And she told these stories about how sometimes people would come into the temple with their various personal issues, problems, and sometimes the nuns would try to patiently listen, but then go back and talk amongst themselves and say, can anybody handle this? I don't know what to do. And so she was just saying, we could really use something to help out in these sort of situations. And I think that story was always in the back of my head as we were starting to plan this and think about some directions to go.
Yeah, it sounds like that the folks who are in settings of Buddhist communities may be very well trained in the tradition, in whatever the views and practices of that are, but there might not be quite as much formal education on running a community itself and how you care for it. So seeing a book like this it's really nice that has happened, that you have this wonderful body of resources that were able to bring it together. So you decided this would be a good idea. You started to partner on this and reach out to others. In the making of the book, what are some things that you yourself learned that you might not have known before, or things that were unexpected? Nathan, what was it for you? What came up?
So much. I mean, on one level, just the knowledge that all the different contributors brought to this project. It's been a good guidebook for me as well. Even in the process of creating it, there's been times where, because some people have known that I'm working on this, and people will ask me, hey, this person came up to me with this issue. Do you know anything about helping with that? And there were a couple times where I contacted the author and I was like, hey, do you mind if you give me information about this? I know your chapter isn't quite done yet, but we could really use some help in this situation. And then that author is happy to help, and I funnel the information along. But it's just a collection of so much of their wisdom that I've already started relying on myself.
There's a lot there. Danny, how about for you? Was there anything that was unexpected that you learned as you were putting this book together?
I think for me, the first things that come up are more maybe process oriented. I think when Nathan and I started, we made a habit of meeting once a week during lunch in my office, and we would, talk for about an hour and take a lot of notes, bat topics back and forth, and try to kind of winnow it down to a working list, and then, possible authors. So we were very organized in the front, but then there were a lot of unexpected, or at least unexpected for me, things that happened in the process that, in many ways were the most valuable part of it. we had some authors who were very good. Like if we just said, here's the sample chapter that Nathan wrote. We were hoping you would write on X topic, and they would sort of take it and run with it. And they were very comfortable and all of that. But then we had other authors who I think, their process is a bit different, and they really want to get precise and have a conversation. It would really work in this wonderful collaborative spirit. And I think because I had contributed to books before that was very much like kind of the first example, that someone would tell you, we'd like you to write on this, you go and do it and turn it in. I was really appreciative for kind of a different process. So, like one author in particular who I worked with, Musha Makeda, who's a remarkable, wonderful Buddhist teacher.
She's been a guest on the podcast before. She's terrific. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And she has this wonderful quality of precision in her thinking and her work. And so for her, having conversations with me, and I think also with Nathan, was very important to kind of figuring out what the book needed and what best she could sort of offer. And I really love those conversations. So when I think of the process of writing, I think often of the conversations Nathan and I had, but also these sorts of wonderful opportunities for thinking in more collaborative ways about putting a book together like this. I mean, I think there's such a kind of tradition of how you do books like this that it's wonderful to see the way Buddhist contributors maybe throw kind of a monkey in that wrench, so to speak, that they have their own maybe way of engaging a project like this that I think is really valuable and results in a better book. I think part of the reason Mushin's chapter is so good is by the time we were done talking, I think she had a very good sense of what was happening in the whole book and maybe who particularly this could benefit and how. And, so it many chapters worked that way. And that was an exciting, valuable part of working on it for me.
Yeah, it sounds like the collaborative experience itself was one of the most beneficial things for each of you in the putting together of this book. And I'm wondering if you can think for just a few moments about what else within the book, perhaps on a topic basis, that was very helpful to you as well. Was there anything that stood out for you, knowing that there's lots of good stuff in there? What in particular touched you as being helpful? And Danny, maybe we can continue with you on this.
Sure. Well, I appreciate Nathan's story about the nun, and a story I had sort of told my students using, with anonymity, was I had once been at a gathering of Buddhist teachers, and there was sort of many well-known Buddhist teachers at this gathering, and one teacher was speaking and was telling a story about working with a student who expressed suicidal thoughts. And he explained how he handled this situation. And I was sitting with another well-known Buddhist teacher who I won't identify. And we both sort of grimaced a little bit. And this teacher leaned over to me and said, boy, did he really dodge a bullet. And what the teacher meant was it was not handled appropriately to kind of what we know about good intervention skills in that situation. And so it seemed to me that we haven't really had a book, or a collected information this way written specifically for Buddhists that really try to help you through a situation like that and give you proper information. So if you're starting from absolute zero on what do I do with a student who's coming to me and wants to talk about their divorce, or what do I do with a student who's coming to me talking about financial problems or a new diagnosis or something like this, you really had to find it other places. And maybe, you can get overwhelmed with information when you Google something or go to the library even.
Which you can't always do when you're in the middle of Dokusan with a student who's bringing up something that's outside of your range of experience.
Absolutely. So, Nathan and I were always talking about this as a book that, wouldn't solve all problems and really just be a beginning for people with information, but it was something that they could pluck down from their shelf and just say, okay, I've got some bare bones information here from experts who know something about Buddhism. So, I can work with this and at least triage this situation. So, I'm grateful basically for the entire book, but, I often think of some of these acute care situations like suicide intervention and things like this, where I've heard stories or, other kinds of things where it's such a crucially important thing, and maybe we don't always have the right information or know what to do. And so just being able to provide a book that has some pointers for more serious matters, I'm just very pleased with that. But, that could be any chapter, really, I think.
Yeah, and I'm seeing that happen more and more with our Buddhist centers, that there's an increasing awareness of the additional needs that may be above and beyond the tradition and how it interacts with those who bring up things like suicidality, for example. Mm-hmm. And so having a resource like this that helps illuminate what some of the options might be that you haven't encountered in your own training as a teacher is extremely helpful. Nathan, how about you? What were some things that you found very helpful as something that's been included in the book?
That very chapter on suicide intervention, I've had a couple experiences where a friend or someone I know suddenly almost let slip or had just kind of a different look, and I inquire and find out that they're somewhat thinking of considering suicide, and these warning bells go off in my head, and I just think, wait, what can I do right now? Like, all other thoughts go aside, and what is the proper action? I don't want to mess this up. So in that kind of a moment, having these sorts of resources around are just really helpful to draw on. So your mind doesn't really want to wander around too much, wants to stay on task, but having just at least a little bit of knowledge about proper things to say and what not to say, things like that, is just almost life-savingly helpful.
Yeah, I'm wondering, Nathan, if that's one of the things that is perhaps an unintended, but I think beneficial outcropping of the book, is perhaps giving a bit more permission for teachers to be human and not have to have all of the answers within the tradition and have everything that comes up in their care for their community be an answer that's straight out of scripture, but maybe something that's a local resource for some challenge someone's going through. Is that something that seems to be coming about?
At least from initial comments I've heard, going back to the story of the nun, this just isn't a part of the normal monastics training or the normal meditation teachers training. And I am from Grand Rapids, Michigan, originally, and it's not exactly a Buddhist hotbed, but there is a couple little temple meditation center places that developed there, and people who take charge there, it's not like there's a whole abundance of other Buddhist resources or training around in the area. And so just having something like this for those kind of communities as well, it just offers some other voices to listen to that come from a Buddhist background specifically.
And it's the training in a monastic role is perfect as training in a monastic role, but there may be a few gaps that books like this are helping to fill around a community of people, that there are needs that might stretch a little bit beyond that deep level of foundational suffering and more into the pragmatics of some issues we're seeing in contemporary society. Nathan, I'm wondering if there's anything else you wanted to share with the listeners?
Well, I think just a couple other examples, because we've mentioned specific one-on-one kind of personal issues, but for example, like Katie Lonk's chapter on race in recent society has been a huge issue, and some of the later chapters talk more about community type issues and even like how to start Dharma programs for children or things like that. And some of the earlier chapters are more about personal skills, so like nonviolent communication, how to develop these kind of things. So I think there's a range in there of skill development that, as you say, doesn't really come with the average monastic training, but can hopefully at least provide a brief glimpse into what people and communities can do to try to build up, get a more supportive community around them.
Danny, how about for you? Is there anything else that you wanted to share with the listeners?
First, Nathan and I feel like have been very conscientious about mentioning the authors. We didn't mention Dwayne Bidwell is the author of the chapter on suicide intervention, and he's a remarkable scholar at Claremont School of Theology, and he's just one of the coolest guys I've ever met. And he really did us he's a very, very busy, very in-demand guy, and did us a huge, huge solid by writing that chapter for us. It was sort of he was a name we put down early for that chapter. We were just like in our wildest dreams, we would get Dwayne to write the chapter on suicide intervention, which to both of us felt so important. So I wanted to make sure we said his his name there. I appreciate, what Nathan said about the later chapters. I think it's fairly safe to say at no point in the building of this book did we presume that Donald Trump would be the 45th president of the United States. And so as it happens, chapters that deal with things like, racism, gender violence, poverty, problems of the world now in a way feel more essential and important than perhaps they did before the election. So it was funny. I was looking at the book the other day and thinking, I'm really glad we got that in there or this. And it felt like not that it wasn't important before, but it sort of feels like this might be front of some people's thinking as they're sort of, I think working with communities that may have, be experiencing, re-traumatization from, past violence because of some of the things that are in the news, or concerned about what may happen with immigration policy or racial violence and unrest getting sort of by, these sort of neo-Nazi groups and things like that. So, I think that in many ways the book feels much more useful to me now than maybe it did in the abstract, sort of when we were planning it before. I don't mean to be too, dire about the future, but it just sort of, there are a lot of things that, I think are very understandable concerns right now. Like, for example, I wrote our chapter on poverty, and I have a kind of long digression there about Social Security, which at one point I wondered if I should leave in, but now with very serious threats to Social Security from the Republican Congress, it sort of feels like, well, kind of glad I left that in, So I feel like there's a new relevancy to the book and a new importance to it as we kind of face at least the immediate future. I sort of feel like in many ways I'm very grateful that it came out when it did, because I'm sure some people in Buddhist communities will be wondering, how do we address this? How do we respond to that? And I think our contributors have a lot of good starting points and maybe good answers and responses to some of those concerns.
I'm glad you brought that up, and listeners to the podcast will notice that there's been an uptick in some of the kinds of interviews we've been doing here around race and diversity and inclusion, with Lamarad Owens on Radical Dharma, with Jay on being trans in Buddhist communities. And it used to be, because I've done these kinds of interviews all along throughout the life of this podcast, those episodes were typically not downloaded as much as other episodes were. And that has changed just last week in taking a look at some of the metrics out of curiosity about what's been happening with those. They've been as popular as the rest of the episodes have been on typically just Buddhist type topics. And that's an encouraging shift. I'm glad to see that these are garnishing the interest I think they have always deserved and earned. But also it speaks to the awareness of our communities that these are important things, and none of us has all the answers. So being able to learn a little bit more and to have people who are actively involved in these things give voice to what some of these issues are and ways of meeting those moments has been a terrific opportunity. And I'm glad that this was something that was also included in the book.
Well, thanks for saying that. I think, it's that's really interesting what you said about the kind of metrics for past shows, and trying to kind of figure out what silver lining there might be. I always hate the expression "it's better late than never," but if what's happening in terms of the transition in government gets people to sort of pay attention to a chapter like Katie's that they might have skipped over before, or chapters like Wayporn Kunakwe's or Steph's and mine, or Mushin's or other people's. I feel like that's important, and so I'm glad we were able to give some room to those voices in the book, and not just room. I think from the beginning that was something that was important to Nathan and I, that this not be another kind of well-intentioned book that maybe really misses some things it shouldn't be missing in this day and age.
Also really grateful for Dr. Hiro Sasaki's contributions to this project, largely in the background, but he really helped in evaluating some of the chapters. We already had the structure of the book and suggesting many other chapters and helping us to get in contact with many of the authors. And so behind the scenes, he really helped a lot in the initial stages of this book. It's instrumental.
And I think if it's okay if I piggyback with John Negru, sort of jumping in and giving us a home for the book when we were kind of on the market. And it's a complicated book, I think, in many ways.
Difficult to print.
Difficult to print. And we've been working on it for 3 years, I guess, from day one to now. And so, there was a sense that, especially with some contributors who worked in academia, we wanted to get it published, in a reasonable amount of time, to benefit them for, promotion, tenure review and stuff like that. So, I felt like we had a kind of, after working on it for so long, we were very anxious to get it going with somebody, and he just sort of responded to our request list with, yep, absolutely. And he landed the deadlines and took really good care of the book, and in many ways kind of improved what we were thinking visually. And I just think it came out, a really nice looking book, and kind of even better as a physical object than I had been hoping for.
Well, for folks who are listening to the podcast, I do have a link to the book on the episode page for this episode. And our guest today, Danny, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Ted.
And Nathan, thank you for joining us as well.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.